I made a zoo using only the birds in Planet Zoo, so let's get into it. I set up a temperate Oceania zoo on hard mode with flat terrain, before once again flexing my superior zoo naming skills. I changed the time of day so that it wouldn't get dark and selected the path I wanted to use for the zoo, after which I struggled to pick what animal I wanted to add first. I heavily considered the Sussex chicken because I think they're rather charming. I did want to start with something a little more interesting though, so I went with the North Island brown kiwi, and after setting up a null barrier, I added a staff area behind the habitat before having the kiwis brought to their enclosure. I also reworked the path so that it wasn't clipping into the barrier, and after adding a guest gate, I changed a section of the null barrier to this hedge barrier. I also had to move the staff buildings outside of the barrier because the kiwis didn't like the flowers on the side of the buildings. To make sure the kiwis couldn't escape, I used rock along the edge of the habitat, which I sunk bushes into. I added a water area before pulling up the greenery, starting with these palm trees, pausing briefly to add this path before I could forget. I added some silver ferns before placing some bushes throughout the habitat and some cattail reeds around the water. I also placed what I called a pointy plant in my notes, along with some ghost fungus, which I don't think I've ever used before, so that's fun. There was still a lot of open, empty space though, so I used this king fern to fill it in, finishing off the greenery with a variety of other plants and flowers, after which I added burrow shelters along with their enrichment. I placed a water treatment facility so their water wouldn't be nasty, along with donation bins and education speakers, before pulling out the rocks, which I placed mostly around the water, along with a few tucked into the foliage, and that was this habitat done. I was very excited to add chickens to the zoo, which is going to be the next animal, but first I needed to add an information center for guests to buy umbrellas from, and I probably could have let my money build up to a more reasonable number, but I was excited for chickens. So I set up a path and put a null barrier in place, which I added guest gates to, after which I bought the chickens and had them brought to the habitat. I decided to change the barrier to chain link, after which I went about trying to add a water source. However, something about chickens having a small pond in their enclosure just didn't seem right, so I added this water pipe instead before going about placing their enrichment items, and adding a shelter before pulling up the greenery tab, where I found these trees which I placed around the habitat. I also found these very fluffy bushes which I thought went well with the trees, along with some dog bushes and a whole lot of flowers. Placing all the flowers did almost bankrupt me though, so I took a brief pause to add some donation bins and hung out with the chickens while I waited for my money to build back up, which didn't take too long, and I was back to placing flowers in no time. And just as I was finishing my flower placing, the kiwis had babies, and cooler still, one of them was leucistic. The less cool part about it was that when I tried to move her so I could see her better, she teleported into the ocean outside of the map. I tried to move her back to the habitat a few times, but it just wasn't working. She did seem content in the water though. I even tried reloading my game, but that also didn't seem to fix the issue. My last idea was to send her to the trade center and have her brought back to the habitat that way. However, all the staff were resting, so I decided to finish the chicken habitat while I waited for the staff. I spent some time fixing the train to the chicken's liking, during which a staff member tried dropping the kiwi back to the habitat, only to deliver an empty box, because she was still in the water. I figured either this problem would fix itself, or this kiwi would become a permanent water resident. Either way, I added education speakers to the chicken habitat and placed a few clusters of rocks, and the Sussex chicken habitat was done. I didn't wait long before jumping into the next habitat, which is going to be for the mute swan, setting up a curvy wooden barrier with a guest path running through it, quickly switching it to chain link because I thought it would look better, along with placing what I thought was an adequately sized pond for the swans. However, after having them brought to the habitat, I learned otherwise, and added this much larger body of water for them, and they seemed pretty pleased with that, so I put up the nature tab where I found my beloved cherry blossom trees, which I placed throughout the habitat. After which I found this dark green holly tree, which I thought went really well with the cherry blossoms. And after placing a few cherry blossom stumps around, I decorated the water, starting underwater before adding common water lilies, cattail reeds, and common reeds along the top. Bushes were next, and since there was a lot of space to fill, I used these large fluffy ones, using a variety of flowers and other plants to finish off the greenery. I did shelter next, opting to use this wooden one, which I placed along the path to double as shelter for the swans and the guests. I did their enrichment and fixed the train to their liking, after which I took a brief trip to see some new kiwi babies. And to my delight, she had another leucistic baby, so there was a backup just in case the one in the water combusted. I did name the water kiwi Seagull though, so hopefully she'll be fine. Back at the swan habitat, it was rock time. I added quite a lot of rocks, most of them being around or in the water, after which I placed donation bins and education speakers and this habitat was done. I forgot to record it, but before getting into the fourth habitat, I placed more shops down by the zoo entrance. I started what would be the American flamingo habitat by placing a chain link barrier next to the chickens. And after changing all the terrain to short grass, I had the flamingos brought to the habitat. I added a water source to the back of the habitat before putting a guest path in place. I placed the waterfall enrichment and went about trying to make my own shelter, which just wasn't turning out all that nice. And while looking for pieces to make it look better, I stumbled upon this pre-built structure, which looked similar to what I was making, but far better. So after modifying it a little bit, I added 2 more to the habitat and waited for the rest of the flamingos to be brought to the habitat, during which a flamingo escaped, which was rude.
You're a little prick, Diego.
And these swans had their first tiny winged babies, which ran off in sync, which was funny. Back at the flamingo habitat, they were unsurprisingly stressed, so I placed a one-way glass barrier along some of the viewing area, before pulling up the foliage and placing holly trees throughout the habitat, paired with these large hydrangea bushes, after which I decorated the water with Amazon water lilies and common reeds, and finished off the greenery by adding underwater eelgrass. I placed down their enrichment items, stopping to add more lilies in the forage pool enrichment because I thought it looked cool. I did rocks next, using them to blend in the forage pool, along with sprinkling smaller rocks throughout the habitat. I fixed the terrain to their liking. I was then introduced to all the problems all at once. So I started with the easiest one, which was having the keeper clean the litter in front of the Kiwi habitat, after which I added benches and trash cans along the paths. The staff also couldn't enter the flamingo habitat, so I moved a few rocks, and that seemed to fix the issue. The staff also weren't able to access this forage pool, however, that's kind of a non-issue, seeing as it still counted towards enrichment, whether they could actually use it or not. So I just dismissed the notification, and I continue to dismiss the notification every single time it pops up. These guys were also stressed, so I placed one-way glass along the whole path instead of just the corners, along with some quiet signs, and after remembering to place donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was officially done. Well, technically their social group was still too small, but them having babies will fix that issue. And I was ready to jump into the next habitat, which is going to be for the greater Rhea.
Where is he? She teleported. Growing up fixed her.
I set up a chain link barrier right next to the flamingos, after which I had the Rhea brought to the habitat and went about setting up these dome viewing areas, which I placed the shelters next to. I added a water area and pulled up the nature tab. I placed a few holly trees around, after which I lined a segment of the fence with bushes, along with placing a few of these hydrangea bushes around the habitat. I did some reeds around the water, but they just didn't look right to me. So after some internal debate, I decided not to add them. And I was hoping that adding rocks would tie the habitat together more, but honestly I don't think it did. But either way, I continued forward and added the enrichment and bedding, along with donation bins and education speakers, after which I fixed the terrain to their liking, and this habitat was done. In between the greater Rhea habitat and the next, I was dealing with swans who insisted on starving. Even after being brought right next to their food, they simply walked away. My fix to this was to hire more staff and to have them sent to animal storage, which automatically feeds them, after which I sent them back to their habitat and all my alerts went away, and I was ready for the next build, which is going to be for the greater flamingo and the Indian peafowl, starting with setting up a chain link barrier next to the greater Rheas, and after placing some water areas around, I added a new staff area on this side of the zoo, after which I had the flamingos and peafowl brought to the habitat. And against my better judgment, I added a guest path, knowing full well that I was going to be dealing with periodically stressed flamingos. I did limit the path to only a small section of the habitat though, which, if you want to know, didn't help, but I tried. I did shelters next, which didn't really look all that good, but I managed to hide them for the most part at least behind these mangrove apple trees, so it's fine. I added cattail and common reeds around the water, after which I indulged in adding some cherry blossoms around. I added a few bushes, trying not to surpass their coverage needs, and after placing down all their enrichment, I added bedding under the shelters, along with fixing the terrain to their liking, after which I added the finishing pieces to this habitat, which was just a copious amount of rocks. and this habitat was finished. I wanted to wait for the rain to stop before jumping into the next habitat. However, the rain was very persistent, so I sucked it up and set up a chain link barrier for what will be the common ostrich habitat, after which I had them delivered and gave them a small pond. I played with the train a little bit before pulling up the greenery, where I found this funny sausage tree. And if you're interested to know, it gets the name from its sausage-shaped fruit, which is poisonous to humans when raw. I lined a section of the barrier with bushes before scattering some around the rest of the habitat, and after placing a few other plants around, I added some common reeds around the water, which far surpassed their plant needs, but that's fine. I added their enrichment before fixing the train and adding bedding. These guys didn't require shelter, by the way, so I won't be adding any. I placed rocks, added donation bins and education speakers, and this habitat was done. Before moving on to the next habitat, I turned on a few of the marketing options to increase my stars, after which I extended my path and added a chain link barrier for what will be the southern cassowary habitat. And after they were introduced to the enclosure, I added a water area before pulling up the nature tab and adding a few trees. And I had a glorious selection of exactly one type of bush, which I can make work. However, to add a nice amount of variety, I placed a few ferns around. The end result was still relatively simple, which left plenty of room for rocks. After placing rocks, I sunk more bushes into them before struggling to find a spot to place the shelter. My fix to that was to just place a shelter outside of the barrier before extending said barrier, which is a tactic I'm going to use more often because the amount of times I set up a habitat without keeping in mind that I need a place to put a shelter is criminal. Moving on, I set up their enrichment and fixed the terrain to their liking, placing down donation bins, education speakers, and after adding bedding under the shelters, this habitat was done. This notification popped up reminding me that I had been neglecting to do any in-between habitat zoo maintenance. So after adding ATMs, I placed shops behind the chickens, along with bathrooms and an information booth by the swans. I placed benches, trash cans, and conservation boards throughout the zoo. Also, all the chickens were dying, so I put all the males left in the habitat on contraceptives so there was no risk of inbreeding, after which I reintroduced a lot of the chickens. One of the chickens escaped, like a fool, which I'm only mentioning so you can enjoy the goofiness that was him running. I hired a chunk of new staff, after which I was almost ready for the next habitat. I just wanted to let the staff train more before adding another habitat and creating more work for them, along with letting a chunk of the animal research finish up. However, I doubt that's as fun to watch as it was to do, so just know that I did those things and we'll jump into the next habitat. Next to the swans, I set up a relatively small chain link barrier, which I could have added walkthrough gates to, but I didn't want to deal with stressed out red-crowned cranes, so I didn't do that. I placed a large pond in the middle of the habitat and added a shelter to the back, after which I placed down the foliage, starting with these fun yellow trees. I added quite a few bushes before moving on to adding water lilies and cattail reeds to the water, and as an afterthought I added some caribou moss along with another underwater plant to finish off the greenery. I added their enrichment next, which unfortunately excluded the cool waterfall enrichment because I couldn't place it without messing up the ground. After adding the enrichment, I fixed the terrain to their liking and moved on to adding rocks, which I kept very simple, focusing most of them in the water and along the barrier, after which I placed donation bins and education speakers and this habitat was done, pretty much immediately jumping into the habitat that gave me the most trouble in this entire zoo, which just so happened to be for the little penguin. I did initially debate making this a habitat for all the penguins, but only 2 of them shared a similar biome, and I decided that it wouldn't look good, for now at least. I do eventually change my mind and add the king penguin to this habitat, but that's not till later. For now I raised the terrain in the back and added a glass barrier, which I used to make an underwater viewing area. A very shallow underwater view, but an underwater viewing area nonetheless. I had the penguins brought to the habitat and changed the terrain to sand before using rocks to make stairs into the water, after which I flattened the terrain more because it was too steep for my liking. I also had to redo the water because it needed to be deeper, and I also deleted the rocks while I was at it. With the water done, for now, I added a burrow shelter and pulled out the greenery, hoping to add a little pizzazz to the habitat. I decorated the water first before adding exactly 2 trees, which I was really hoping covered most of the wonky looking terrain in the back, along with making a section of the barrier null and adding a rock wall, which I sunk bushes into. After adding rocks throughout the rest of the habitat, I added enrichment and fixed the terrain to their liking. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, I considered this habitat done. For now. I logged off after making this habitat, and when I logged on the next day, I decided that it just wasn't doing it for me. So I decided to redo this habitat. Looking back, I should have just trashed the whole thing and started entirely over, but instead I simply extended the barrier around the path and added a walk-through gate. I added the guest path and extended the water, after which I introduced the king penguins to this habitat. Little penguins and king penguins don't come from the same region. However, they do come from the same continent, so I was determined to make it work. The deciding factor being whether or not they attacked each other, which luckily they didn't. So I continued forward, pulling back up the nature tab. The king penguins didn't like the bushes I had used, so I had to delete them. They also just wanted a lot less coverage in general. So I used only the eelgrass because the other underwater foliage took up too much of the coverage percentage. I added cattail reeds and common reeds, after which I spent some time adding rocks, along with adding a shelter for the king penguins, before looping back around and replacing all the rocks with these tundra rocks instead because I thought they looked better. I added their enrichment before fixing the terrain, after which I added donation bins and education speakers. And after getting the soil ratio right for the little penguins and adding coolers for the king penguins, I was done with this habitat. I wouldn't say it was finished because it could have been better, but I was done with it. My plan was to add the second to last animal, which is the African penguin, next to the other penguins, but I didn't leave any room to add another habitat over there, so I moved to the other side of the zoo next to the flamingos, where I set up a chain link barrier with a guest path. I added water to the habitat before having the African penguins introduced to the enclosure. I started with adding a shelter, after which I pulled up the foliage tab and added a few trees around. I added the underwater plants and placed a variety of foliage around the water's edge. And after adding a few bushes, I placed down all the enrichment, after which I made the water deeper and had to fix the plants so they weren't just floating there. I fixed the terrain to their liking and then it was rock time, which I placed mostly in the water. And after placing donation bins and education speakers, I thought I was done with this habitat. However, a short while later, the penguins were having stress issues. So I placed one-way glass along the guest path, along with a few quiet signs. And then this habitat was actually done. I jumped straight into the last habitat, which is going to be for the emu, the only bird to ever win a war. I set them up a chain link barrier between the red-crowned cranes and the southern cassowary, extending the barrier to encapsulate a shelter, after which I had the emus brought to the habitat. And after adding a water source and placing bedding under their shelter, I pulled up the plants, where I found this really cool baobab tree, which was a little too big to add more than just one, so I placed a few of these cabbage trees around also, after which I added a few cattail and common reeds around the water, before lining a small section of the barrier with bushes, which I also sprinkled around the rest of the habitat. I messed with the terrain a little bit before adding the enrichment items, after which I finished the terrain and pulled up the rocks, which I sprinkled throughout the habitat before sinking bushes into them. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. There were still a few things I wanted to finish around the zoo though, starting with re-enriching all the habitats. I also upped the food quality for all the animals, or at least all the animals I had it unlocked for. Some of the animals also needed more shelter, so I fixed that, after which I added more food and drink shops, along with more benches, trash cans, and vending machines for the guests. The cranes were getting stressed, so I changed a section of their barrier to one-way glass, after which I added education talk points to all the habitats, going through after to add more education boards throughout the zoo. There was also a congestion problem happening at the front of the zoo, so I placed another entrance at the other end of the zoo to hopefully fix the issue. All the animal research was also done at this point, so I was able to up the food quality for all the animals. And after placing conservation boards, I named all the habitats. After which I pulled up the nature tab and spent absolutely forever decorating the zoo, finishing it all off with decorating all the habitats with various statues and signs, which was a wrap for the zoo. So that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.